Is everybody popping in, or do I have to keep approving? Attendees. Okay, I see people starting to pop in. I think this is my Read AI, so we're just going to kick it out since we are recording. Possibly. Okay. All right, so while people are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kristen Henry. I am the secretary of the MCDA, the Maine Community Development Association. The Maine Community Development Association is a statewide network of professionals dedicated to strengthening Maine's communities through collaboration, innovation, and best practices in economic and community development. The MCDA serves as a vital resource for municipal leaders, planners, and practitioners seeking to navigate the challenges and opportunities of rural development in Maine. This MCDA Masterclass series is a professional development initiative designed to equip members and partners with advanced tools, strategies, and insights from industry leaders and subject matter experts. Each session is going to explore a topic throughout a housing and development with insights from industry leaders. We're going to offer practical takeaways for implementation at the local level. Our goal here in this series is to do a little bit more than just the information sharing. We want to take it a step further and provide the participants with actionable items that they can take away back to their communities to begin the process of taking ownership over their ultimate goals for the community. So without further ado, I'm going to throw this over to Robin Stanicki, who is our first presenter and teacher, if you will. Robin, if you can introduce yourself, and you can get right into it whenever you want to.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen. So good morning, everyone. I am Robin Stanicki, and I work for the City of Bangor as our Community Development Officer. So here in Bangor, I work on housing, infrastructure, business development, and other projects that support community growth. But I also live in a rural town of Unity, and before I came to Bangor to work, I was a community resilience planner at Kennebec Valley Council of Governments, and I assisted 67 member communities with a range of different planning support, including strategic planning projects that involved community visioning. But prior to KVCOG, I actually was not involved in municipal government at all. I actually emerged from organizational support and quality improvement processes. And I was mainly working for large clinical microsystems, large hospitals, and rural regional clinics. And my world was essentially planning on a different scale. So instead of residents, business owners, municipal leaders, we focused on patients, healthcare professionals, and insurance companies. So it was a different world, but the structure was essentially the same. And we engaged something that's called systemology, sort of the science of understanding how everything is connected and interdependent on each other. And I think it really relates to this discussion today about community visioning. So, you know, the synergy in this is that it's rooted in community. So in all of the communities that we live and work in, identify with, we find something relatable. And the science of systems is concerned with understanding how to create optimal efficiency by ensuring that the machine itself works well. And the fuel of this machine is essentially what we're talking about today, is crafting a vision and staying focused on that, even as conditions change, you know, factors outside of our control. So the community of any type or size can unite around a shared vision and the agreements that come out of it. And essentially, that's what functional societies are made of. So systems thinking is most valuable when we build teams that are united around that shared vision, even when those teams are incredibly diverse in other ways. Okay, so next slide, please, Hope. So what I'd like to talk about today is the societal change that indicates the need for strategic vision, what it is, some best practices and case studies in those community visioning exercises, and some lessons and tools. Next slide, please, Hope. So let's talk a little bit about why visioning is necessary. So for many of you, the concept of visioning is probably resonant within, for myself, it started out within the framework of an organization in terms of mission, vision, and values. And so often an organization will publish a mission statement or describe a vision, concept, or values that drive their work. So we can expand that concept to the top of the hierarchy of planning and describe the role that any organized team, resident groups, local government officials, each with our own mission, is a critical part of this puzzle. So Hope, next slide, please. Okay, so communities need a vision for several reasons. We're all subject to local, global trends that have local impacts. And local communities are on the front line of change. I have a little sticker on my laptop that says planners are the profession that manages change, and it's really true. But local authorities are often caught in a reactive mode, and strategic vision is indicated by a need for resiliency to combat, those ebbs and flows in things that we often cannot control. So the most powerful vision is grounded in community through a multitude of steps that get everyone engaged to create that. And its effectiveness depends on the scale. Next slide, please, Hope. So our world is changing, as we know. We have population growth, demographic shifts. We have migration, both domestic migration, into the state, and then foreign migration into the country and into the state. And that creates many levels of diversity. We do have environmental stresses and resource depletion, things like economic globalization, restructuring, tariffs, lots of things like that. There's a lot of technology, information, and communication, different ways that we're learning to interact with one another. And then, of course, we have social and cultural shifts that we're constantly learning about and adjusting our worldview. Next slide. So the socio-political environment is important to talk about, and not just in terms of what we think about local politics and, on the national and global scale, but it really is important to think about the way that groups interact with each other, and just humans in general react to each other. People naturally resist change. And, if this is a world of planners, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. Planners manage change. And sometimes in our experience, we find that to be more challenging than in other times. So often in this strategic planning, we are coaching teams to resist the urge to look down too much and to focus on the horizon. And if we do that well, we're actually finding that in our community, we can build cohesion with a vision for change. Next slide. So what is vision? As a collaborative process, it's used to see the future. So things people love about their community, challenges that they want to address and solve, and new aspects that they'd like to see become part of their community. So on the abstract, I think it's really important to kind of think about this in a couple of different ways. So we'll look at this from a very expanded view about what is vision in the abstract, and then we'll talk about it in terms of what it can accomplish in very specific terms. So we might consider building a blueprint grounded in the very abstract. So instead of form, we might think about function in terms of Instead of skyline, we might think about how something provides service. Instead of a profile, we might think about what its purpose is. And then instead of thinking about growth, we can think specifically about change. And so by grounding that, we're thinking about how does your community want to live? As a preferred destination, the vision begins with identity. So we're thinking about this in terms of it's a very long-term vision. It's comprehensive. So you're thinking about the system. It's value-based. It is direction-oriented, and it is motivational. So let's look at what it might be in sort of the smaller concept. Hope, next slide. So in a near vision, you're looking at a shorter term duration, very specific. You're looking at evidence-based changes with an action plan that is very detailed and instructional. So you can see how we've gone from a very broad concept of visioning to something very specific that you might see within a strategic plan. Hope, next slide. Okay, so what can visions accomplish? Let me just look at where I lost my notes. Notes. So a vision can accomplish within that strategic plan. We're looking at assessing community conditions. We can explore alternative scenarios. We can actually chart that preferred scenario. We can create that action plan, and we can use that vision to measure our progress and compare where we are into where we're going. So these benefits include, increasing our community engagement and collaboration. We can enhance our decision making. We can build a stronger community identity. And in that way, we're building a more effective plan for the community. By identifying those needs and priorities, we can ensure that those resources are directed to address those needs more effectively. Next slide, Hope. So I pulled in a couple of slides that I use in another presentation. And so this is a graphic that talks about the strategic plan, but it gives you a really interesting visual about where vision sort of fits into organizational planning or even strategic planning that I use specifically for the Community Development Block Grant Program here at the city of Bangor. And so it places vision at the top. And it talks about a very, the future state, a very global aim, which is inspiring and long-term. And it is still in the very abstract. And so what we do in our strategic planning is we are talking to stakeholders, and those stakeholders often have a stated mission, a vision, and value statement, as I mentioned. And so we're engaging them to engage their purpose within this larger shared vision, what that organization does, the people that it serves, and how it adds value to the community. And so then from there, we're able to build goals that are specific and measurable. And then from those goals, there are specific objectives that are engaging a specific strategy. So there's an evidence-based approach within that strategy. And then finally down to an action plan. So this graphic really kind of shows you where we plug in vision in all of that. Hope, next slide, please. This slide I use to kind of talk about those elements again in a kind of a different way. So the direction that that's going, it's still in an upward mobility. So we're thinking about a vision as more broadly community oriented, and then all of these other elements and their direction within that framework. So visioning as a process. So we've got a couple of elements here that we need to think about. So we start by learning more. We do community needs assessments. We think about the 5 Ps, which is something that I brought in from organizational consulting. We think about, again, like I said, there's definitely a synergy between work in other spaces where we think about the people, we think about the purpose, the professionals, the process, and the different patterns to try to figure out exactly what those community needs are, and specifically what might need to change or what we can use to change them. We also talk about sharing, so we incorporate community voices. We want to ensure meaningful participation, so we're thinking about, access and diversity of thought, and specifically that exercise is in building trust. And this is something that is incredibly important when you're thinking about, for example, working with rural communities. Often my experience was that rural communities um, were very difficult to want to work together with another community, a neighboring community. It was very difficult to build trust in an environment of resource scarcity, for example. And even among, organizations within a region, I found that the exercise of building trust was, that initial hurdle that we often encountered. And again, in that, the size matters. So, what works for an urban community of Bangor is not also going to work for a rural community such as Unity. You wouldn't think, but Unity is very difficult to work with, which is why we don't have a comprehensive plan that's newer than 1992. But anyway, moving on. So then we talk about the strategies. What can we try? What are those best practices? We do some research into our knowledge base. We try out some scenarios to kind of talk about, what direction we might want to work in. And then visioning is also very role defining. Who is going to help this? How do groups fit in within the direction that they are going and the values that they espouse in doing their work? And then how do we create buy-in into this strategy? And, in that way, it's very much a campaign, to be able to garner support for this, this plan and this vision. Hope, do you want to move the slide? Okay. So in visioning, we think about 5 driving questions. So if you are a planner, you do recognize this as a particular state model called the Oregon model, which was derived out of this understanding that we really did want to expand this on a larger scale to try to understand, where our community needs to go and where we are now. Okay, Hope, next slide, please. So what we need to do first is we need to figure out who is driving the bus. And so a steering committee is incredibly important to the visioning process. It should represent a diverse range of stakeholders from all segments in the community. And I'll give you an example as we're going through this. As we were building our community, our economic development strategy for the Kennebec Valley region, my role in that process actually was to form the steering committee and actually create the visioning portion of this project. So, we invited a stakeholder group of about 18 people from all segments of the community. This does keep that committee accountable to the public because they all represent a certain aspect of the community. And the ideal size is large enough to represent all of those perspectives, but you do need to keep it small enough to remain effective and manageable. Typically larger groups have a more difficult time getting things done. So you do want to think about the sectors of, residents, business owners, government leaders, other professionals in that work, and then community groups that might be organically organized, such as neighborhood groups. I can't tell you how many neighborhood groups I sit on Facebook just to hear the buzz, to see what's going on. I think that that is a really great way to, in any visioning exercise, to go into those community groups and to see if you can find representation on your steering committee. Hope, if you want to advance. So the ideal steering committee is going to be diverse. You want to ensure that those members can commit to the task. It is a process. There is going to be multiple meetings. There is going to be some dedication to facilitating the process, so that is important. Communication skills are also very important. You need to have folks that are willing to cooperate. They're facilitating all of this community engagement, disseminating information. And a big value here is also that they have local knowledge. They can have an understanding of the community's history, current state, the resources, and aspirations. And then also, finally, the committee is going to be responsible for making key decisions throughout the visioning process. Hope, if you want to move. Okay, so here are the roles and responsibilities that we published for the steering committee within the visioning process for the SEDS. So we did a lot of facilitating community engagement. So this was organizing meetings and workshops. We guided the visioning process overall. So leading these discussions, setting goals, and developing that shared vision statement. And then there's also a lot of promoting the process and getting people excited and translating that vision into those concrete actions and the next steps. You should consider how these roles and responsibilities will also enhance buy-in. So thinking about who you might be inviting to this visioning committee to kind of understand how we can engage all members of the community and create that sort of credibility in the community can sometimes be a challenge. And then also consider the level of support needed in these exercises, either by a consultant or a staff within your local government that's kind of helping out, because it can be administratively heavy. Oh, okay. So let's talk a little bit about, in the beginning, best practices for the visioning process and some of what's involved. So let's talk about first this community needs assessment. This is the where are we now of the visioning process. So what we need to do first is we need to look around. We need to do a community needs assessment to find out, well, what do we know? And the first part of this is a data analysis. Before we can go to, the larger community and gather input, it's important to do our homework. So we need to go back to those 5 Ps, as I mentioned. We need to consider those people, the places, those practices, processes, and patterns that make up all of the system elements in our community. So there's a lot of data sources that we can consider, and Hope, if you want to go to the next slide. So some of these sources include the US Census. When we're thinking about demographic trends, you can find migration trends. We can also see in the US Census a variety of different makeup of the community, such as race and ethnicity, and those might become very helpful. You have the American Community Survey, which is on a smaller scale. So the US Census is a 10-year survey. The American Community Survey actually is 1-year and 5-year data. So you can use that to compare and contrast on a more micro level of what those changes are. And I think that that's a really important aspect when you're thinking about pre and post COVID trends. So that's really important to kind of dig into. You might be looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS tracks certain industry, job trends, things like that. Another one that's really fun is the State of Maine Housing Dashboard. Actually, the State of Maine maintains a couple of dashboards that you can manipulate certain data to get a sense of housing production, the type of units. You can actually find a lot of this housing information in the American Community Survey, so you can find out a little bit more there. Then you might also be thinking about education data in the SEDS, but also in some of the other visioning exercises we've done. We've specifically looked at graduation rates, literacy, and school level statistics. One metric that's really helpful is thinking about fourth grade reading level. So, jot that down. That's a really great metric to think about literacy, for example. Because in the fourth grade, that is when you're doing a lot of NUIA testing. I don't remember what NUIA stands for, but we've all probably taken those tests in fourth grade. So there's a lot of data there. And then you might also look at funding trends. One of the big things that we do here is we look at funding trends of our homeless facilities. Which is a really critical aspect of thinking about how the community needs are actually being met. Then we can also think about state and federal grants, pass-through funding, and other state-supported projects. And I think that this is really important right now to think about those funding trends in light of, those anticipated financial challenges and burdens that might be upcoming. And then you might also be looking at local data. Recently, I've been looking at our assessing data as we've been doing a state revaluation. So our assessing data is going to kind of give us a sense of what resources we might have in our TIF funds. We might be looking at our local DMV records to find out, for example, how many EV vehicles are registered, to kind of find out, what infrastructure needs we might have to support that. So lots of data to be held there. Another aspect you might use is called an eco map. Now this is kind of the touchy-feely social work aspect that I can bring to this presentation. We think about mapping a community ecosystem as really thinking about how everything is connected into our plan. So you're thinking about our nouns, our people, places, and things. Hope if you want to advance the slide. Once we've collected all of this information, we can assemble that and then bring it to the community to provide input. This provides some qualitative and quantitative data, depending on what you're looking for. You might be thinking about this neighborhood-based, you might be thinking about this citywide, or even on a regional scale. You want to design a variety of touch points. You're discussing community needs and challenges, and then you're returning to talk about a vision for the future. So there's a couple of different ways that you're going back to the community and showing them what you've learned throughout the process. I think it's also really important to think about keeping that systems thinking. It provides an opportunity to keeping it positive and also blameless, because let's face it, we're in an environment where as assessing the current landscape, we can be inviting politics and divisiveness and friction to the table before the menu is even created. And I would challenge you to begin thinking about visioning first by thinking about it in terms of a system, because when we do that, we're not focusing on any one individual, we're not focusing on any one organization, but we're thinking about the community as a whole and the way that we all interact with one another. And we can do that using some familiar resources. Some of us are very familiar with using a SWOT analysis, but there are alternatives that I've also provided in this presentation in some links at the end. Thinking about alternatives to SWOT include SOAR, PESTLE, and noise. And so let's see, SOAR replaces the weaknesses and threats. It gives you aspirations and results instead. So it's a more positive approach to visioning that gives you a little bit more help in this particular environment. Hope, if you want to move the next slide. Okay. So this framework, noise, is one that I like particularly. And, you know, it's often used for organizational purposes, but if we use this as a vision-based technique, a tool, we're using needs, opportunities, improvements, strengths, and exceptions. And the premise behind this is that you frame issues in terms of what you don't have rather than what you need to overcome. And this might be helpful to create a plan that focuses on identifying obstacles, you know, in a more positive manner than seeing a long list of strategies done wrong and challenges to overcome. It engages that systems thinking to peel back the layers of the community and its interdependence on the whole environment. Hope, if you want to move this. Okay, so some ideas for engaging residents that I've found helpful and been involved in my work is number one, creating community installations. This can be incredibly important. Residents can engage and provide feedback at any time that's convenient for them. You can use spaces such as libraries, sidewalks, even marquees. We have used a lot of QR codes to provide more information. And using QR codes allows you to put a lot of information in a small space. I was involved in a project in which we put a QR code on a really attractive little decal and disseminated those decals that were put on business, like their doors, so that when a customer would open the door, they would see this decal and they would be prompted to use their phone to access more information about that particular initiative. Don't forget to use your webpage and social media. That's really important because I think, you know, 80% or better of the community's information, they're looking for it on social media, they're sharing it. One thing you might try is to use a product called Linktree. There is a free version to Linktree, and you can provide easy access to multiple sites. You can use a QR code. That QR code will come up with one really succinct page that has multiple sites. You can name those sites and you can kind of control, instead of looking at multiple websites, you can actually pull a page from several websites that, you know, you want residents to see and assemble that information in an easy to access manner. So then also, it can be really important to also have those in-person touch points with listening sessions. And this is where scale is important. So you might think about small group meets. I think it's really engaging to hop on to existing meetings and events. Think about where the resource fairs are that you're thinking about. You know, maybe tabling is an appropriate way to engage the community. You want to schedule plenty of time for meaningful engagement. Lots of questions. You know, if you're doing a resource fair, expect that there'll be, you know, a couple of people at your table that want to talk to you. You also want to think about accessibility options. So virtual meetings, how do participants request an accommodation? So that's particularly important. And then finally, you want to share out what was learned broadly, not specifically. Don't say, Tom told me this, unless, they say that that's okay. And you also want to think about creating an information repository as you go through this process. Where can folks get information about the entire visioning process, the information that you learn, the meeting schedules, and things like that. And again, Linktree might be a good way to accomplish that. So next slide, Hope, please. So the next part of this is, where are we going? So we've talked about where are we now. Now we want to think about the trends and projections. We're pulling back that data. We're thinking about what the community told us. We want to identify patterns and conditions to find out where we're going. This is where scenario planning is really helpful. We want to, again, consider the context of the statewide, regional, and local needs, and the effects of different choices on the community, or even on a particular household. And so in this, we actually want to resolve the question, is this where we want to go? Is this a trajectory that we, really planned for? And how far off, essentially are we? One thing that we might want to consider in this exercise is community capitals. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, but there are various capitals that we can think of. Within each community, there are various assets that contribute to the potential. And a couple of these include financial capital, which are the financial resources that are available to invest in the community. This includes supporting business development, entrepreneurship, and how individual households accumulate wealth. You're thinking about political capital. This is access to power. This is power brokers such as local, county, tribal, state governments, and then also leveraging resources on a regional scale. You think about the built capital, which is your community infrastructure. Natural capital is all of your environmental assets, parks and farmland, and other features of the landscape that might present tourism opportunities. You're thinking about cultural capital, which is the way that people act and interact. This also incorporates the values, rituals, customs, and habits that are often shared and practiced. And this is one of the most important things when you're thinking about working with rural communities, because this is the culture shift that is really prominent in those environs. Human capital is, it's our human resources. These are the skills, abilities, educational potential. This also addresses the leadership capacity of a community to be inclusive and proactive in shaping the future. So you're also thinking about unity with 3 select board members, and then Bangor with a 9-member city council and a host of staff. So where is your human capital in that? And then your social capital reflects those connections between people and organizations, and those ties that create trust and networking. So that's really important. Hope, if you want to advance. Okay, so fortunately for many people, there is a fundamental appeal to talk about the future of their community. And that reason is probably the importance of place. And I think it's really important to stop and talk a little bit about placemaking that people relate to and care about where they live. So it's one of the basic ways that people continue to connect as human beings. So forming that community's vision statement is incredibly important. And this is where we talk a little bit more about identity. The vision statement should be brief, detailed about significant attributes of the community, and sort of like the who are we? What is our story? And it's important to think about it in terms of, our future generations. What will they enjoy, remember, and appreciate? Oh, next slide, please. Okay. So in placemaking, we can think about those deeply valued processes for who feels connected to the places in their lives. I've included a couple of resources to talk about placemaking. And the jumping off point for that discussion is what makes a really great place. So engaging the community in your visioning exercises, this is a really great point to start. Hope if you want to advance. Okay. So the next two steps really are folded into each other, and they kind of go a little bit beyond the visioning statement into action planning. It does support the vision statement, but it talks about what is the desired outcome, who is responsible for specific tasks. And then you also want to think about engaging the SMART method, which is thinking about your vision, supporting your action plan as specific, measured, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. You want to use goal outcome indicators. You're thinking about directionality. So you're wanting to increase, decrease, have more, have less. And so that's incredibly important than just saying our goal is economic development. It can sometimes be difficult to teach someone like what the directionality should actually accomplish. And you also want to think about your action plan in terms of what to do if you get off track. Who's responsible for that? Because this is going to be likely a multi-generational exercise. Okay. So I wanted to give us some case studies in visioning that I've chosen two that gives you a very broad aspect of visioning, and then one that was here in the city of Bangor that was very, very specific. So let's first talk about Impact 2032, which was an initiative in the whole of Kennebec County. This was led by the United Way. I was a member of a small steering committee, and essentially what we were designing was a really large scale vision for the entire Kennebec Valley. And we were talking about specific focus areas within the community. So we created a vision within 3 schemas, and this was health, education, and financial stability. So our vision for health was to build strong, healthy communities, again, very broad. In education, we focused on giving kids equal opportunities. And then finally, in vision, to improve financial stability for everyone. So these vision statements are very, very broad and provide a jumping off point for all of the members that espouse this vision statement to be able to fall in line and bring their own mission to this initiative. Hope if you want to advance. Okay. So we started this process in 2021. We published a regional community survey that went out, to the entire community. We also created and facilitated 5 community conversations sessions. We did offer this in multiple languages. We learned that some of the top issues that most community members considered very important and things that directly affected all community members actually fell in line with those 3 visioning statements that I mentioned. We also looked at, from a point of data gathering, all of those different, specific metrics that I mentioned earlier. And then we also conducted a white paper meta-analysis, which essentially is, taking a lot of research from multiple sources, putting it in a pot, stirring it up, and then coming out with certain findings from which we could build this new visioning statement from an evidence-based perspective. And for us at that particular moment, it was incredibly important for us to consider the context of COVID-19. It was 2021 and 2022, but even now in 25 and even into 26 and beyond, I think it's still going to be incredibly relevant to consider those long-range effects, even 7-10 years later. In 2022, we moved past, that process. We drafted and reported out of our community listening sessions. We decided on those 3 focus areas, and it was important for us to think about those focus areas in terms of how would we know that we are getting somewhere? What did we need to see for specific guideposts and metrics? And this is where that 4th grade reading level really came into mind, is how do we know that we are moving in the direction of our vision? What is most important to think about? And so that's something that I would encourage you to really discuss in your steering committee, is how do you know that you are staying on track with your vision? What are the guideposts that you're looking at to get you to that next point? And then finally, what we did was we gathered commitment statements from regional stakeholders. These were regional planning organizations. These were large industry organizations, and we unveiled Impact 2032. This photo I took of a couple of our steering committee members from the United Way, the director of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, and the CEO of Maine Health, Chuck. I can't remember his last name. All I can think of is Schumer, and that's not his last name. Anyway, next slide, please. And so then moving forward, we wanted to keep the stove hot. So we're thinking about regional meetings going forward. We want to engage new partners and new community assets. We want to fold those into the conversation. We're consistently updating data. So we're going back to those metrics, making sure that we're on track. And we also created an information repository, impacts2032.org. It does explain the system that we created, and it also continues to keep folks engaged, collect more commitment statements, and to keep that initiative moving forward to the full 10 years. So that was Impact 32. And now I want to talk a little bit about a case study that brings it down to sort of this micro level, to visioning for a specific project. I brought this up because it was suggested that this particular visioning exercise was a helpful way to think about community engagement and bringing in the general public in a visioning exercise. And so for the city of Bangor, we were looking at, actually, to plug this into sort of the larger context, in 2019, we did a housing study. We formed that steering committee, and we were thinking strategically, what do we need to do to address housing? In 2019, we didn't really have the housing problem that we have now, but we got a good start. So we had this preliminary housing study that created some findings. We then worked on a housing production plan. And part of that production plan in that larger housing study, we identified a city-owned 10-acre lot, which was our former tree nursery. And we discovered that this was a particular resource that we could use to address a housing shortage. We then contracted with an architect who designed a charrette for the general public to say, well, what do you see for this particular plot of land? What could housing look like? So we wanted to know from the community what needs could be met in this vision of housing on this particular lot, and what do you see? So it was particularly important to understand that this was not a visioning in terms of function and service. It was really a form-based exercise. So we'll look at it here in the next slide. So we wanted to learn about the average size and type of housing desired, and then how the community would interact and support that project. So when we're thinking about designing this affordable housing, we were trying to get ahead of, the NIMBYism that we often see in housing projects of this size. So we started with a presentation by city officials about the unmet housing needs and the specific characteristics of this property. And then our architects facilitated a charrette activity with the attendees to draft potential development scenarios with examples of housing typologies and including parking, pathways, shared amenities, and green spaces. And I wish I had an example of the actual pieces that we used, but if you can imagine little Monopoly houses, they were a little bit larger than that, but they were like little 3D things. So often using like multimodal manipulatives to facilitate some of these activities are particularly helpful because it does give you something to look at in this sort of vision. Hope, if you want to get the next slide. This was one of my favorite design charrettes scenarios because it did start with, just a pen and a marker. One of the teams named this the pickle. And I think it's really plain to see that they gave some thought to the number and the size within each building. We did have 12 distinct design ideas. It went from 16 units to 73 units. And then when we published our RFP and our developer choice most closely aligned with the designs from this activity. So this is the circle back from that. Next slide. That's it, I guess. So I've given you some resources here. I'm not sure how many links will be available in the chat, but we'll also share this presentation. I've given you links to all of the data sources that I've mentioned, and then also one other, thinking about economic mobility is another way to think also about income and financial stability. And then some of these planning tools for the eco maps for placemaking. Also, an author of a paper that talked about placemaking from the University of Maine at Fort Kent. I really liked that resource, so I've always kept it. It is not Gabe Govin. So just to put that out there, same name, different individual. We also think about those community capitals that I mentioned. There's a fact sheet here. And also, thinking about that in terms of planning, we have a couple of other one block at a time toolkit, and then the SWOT analysis. There are a couple of alternatives that you might use, including the noise and the SOAR analysis. So take a look at these. These might be helpful in thinking about visioning. Thank you very much for having me today. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. If you can't think of any now and think later, I've included my email here on this slide also. So.
Okay, so I'm still relatively new here to Teams, so let me allow mics. I did have a question that I popped into the Q&A. Hope, are you able to open that up while I figure out how to unmute people? The Q. Okay, perfect. If you'll do that.
To answer the first question that I know everyone always has, yes, these slides will be available as well as a recording either today or tomorrow. Um,
Okay.
so Kristen asked, Kristen Henry, you spoke about abstract planning and alternative solutions. How do you balance creative thinking with the practical constraints that rural or under-resourced communities often face?
I'm on mute. So I think that that's a really important thing. And that's what abstract planning can really do for the community, because you are really thinking about the identity of that community, and staying really focused on that um, helps you think about how do we really want to live, and how you might want to live in Madawaska, for example, and how you might want to live and how you want to interact with your community um, in Portland is going to be very different. Um, so one of the exercises that I think is really important is called the red light, green light exercise. So if you asked a community if there were no boundaries, what would be their vision for the future? What would be something that they would want to see? And then think about the values and the identity that's espoused in this. Getting to a point where your resources match what your identity is. I think one example you could think of is the town of Skowhegan. Now, Skowhegan has certain resources, and they also do not have certain resources. But what they decided to do was they built their identity around their natural environment. So they started to create a campaign around their tourism industry. Um, and it's worked out really well for them over the last couple of years. They've really expanded that concept of their community, and it allowed them to focus on what are the specific resources they wanted to expand on, to go for in terms of grants and other uh, you know funding opportunities. And that's how they sort of built the success that they've had to date. It unified and sort of focused a specific vision, and that actually is a really great success story. And I think it begins with identity, and that's how you can customize that specific um, visioning.
Perfect. Thank you. Deb Johnson has a question. Deb, you can unmute and unvideo if you want to, or video. Everybody can unmute now at their will.
Well, that's a dangerous thing. Robin, this was excellent, really excellent. Well done. And I think if we offer it up, people that have not seen it will love it. It's really well done. You did a good job. And I learned a new phrase. I had to write it down. Multimodal manipulatives.
Toys.
I wrote it right down. I'm like,
No,
oh
five
my
times real fast, Deb.
Oh my, no, but that was really great. And I love the idea of taking that example of the housing piece, which is always critical. And the one thing that I take away from all of this is it always seems like, in the comments there is some stuff, like Kristen pointed out, when people go, oh, it's too big, it's too much. Is this, you can always take big picture stuff like this and then make a skeleton version to fit whatever size community, much like the downtown Main Street Center models where they have different tiers for the sizes of the communities. You don't have to go all big. You pick out some items from this framework and then use it, meet them where they're at. If it's one or two things, and I think that this whole this whole presentation, you can pluck out little gems, cherry pick, if you will, what you need. And I think it was really well done, and just a great job. Really, really great job.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Deb, for that feedback. I know we're running up on time, but I did, before we go to more questions, I don't know if Robin's able to stick around a little bit. There's fears that somebody's going to pack her up in a box and move her. So I do want to point out, though, in our chat that the materials that Robin did reference, are available there for download. And we will have those added to the MCDA website at some point here. But I also want to point out a couple of other things. I know Robin mentioned a needs assessment, right? Making sure that you knew what you needed to vision, really. So I popped in a web app that I'm working on specifically for Aroostook County, but it can be adapted. I'm looking for people to beta test that, and that does test community needs. So I wanted to offer that up for beta testing if anybody wants to access that, with the understanding that it is Aroostook County, and provide feedback. I think it could help give some clarity. Also, I popped in the Maine state housing data. I love that website. It saves me hours and hours and hours of sifting through the ACS. So I popped that in there as well. And what MCDA wanted to offer up is we wanted to pull some information from Robin's slides and just create some prompts that might assist communities in getting some things down on paper. So I did create a very small visioning workbook based on Robin's slides with a few simple prompts, and I did pop that into the chat as well. So now I'm done talking. If anybody else has any questions for Robin, or Robin has any follow-ups.
No, I think I would just wrap that up by saying, it sounds like people had some comments about scale, and Deb really had a great point that you can cherry pick in this process. And I did give a couple of examples in which, we took an aspect of a community, whether it was housing, financial stability, or whatever those values really focused on in some of your community needs assessments, to say, okay, what can we focus on that's actionable, that's manageable, and that has a likelihood of success. So if you're thinking about where's the money going to come from, why should we care, it inherently is focusing on what do we care about, rather than where's the money going to come from. Mm-hmm. Because it's setting yourself in a direction. So thinking about this is just going to bring in people we don't want, there's your political environment that you will have to manage. It's the elephant in the room. So that's just kind of where we're at.
Good deal. I also dropped your PowerPoint into the chat so that people could access those links, if that's okay.
That's great.
All right. So with time running over, if nobody has any other questions, I wanted to thank Robin from the bottom of my heart for being brave and being our very first facilitator for these master classes. If anybody has any feedback for some of our future classes, we definitely respect that and would love to hear that. And Robin, thank you. Fantastic. Just great job. We appreciate you.
Thanks so much.
You, Robin. Good luck moving your office.
Everybody have a great day.